Welcome back, everyone, to another great recap where we continue our speed run of the GOATS games. So, obviously, as you all know, Magnus Carlsen has been back in the classical chess, um, tournaments, with the tournament that he has played recently in Malmo, Sweden. So, in the first part of these recap videos, I did feature his first four games where he played players of the likes like Jordan van Forest, who happens to be Dutch number two, Arjun Erikayisi, who happens to be India number one, and so on. So today we will be looking at his round five, six, and seven games, which he played um, against Zhu Jina from China. In round six, I believe he played Andy Woodward from the US, and in round seven, the appetizer of the day, the main event of the day rather, he played the Turkish phenom Yaz Khan at Dogmush. So in round five, Magnus is playing against Zhu Jiner from China, who happens to be women's world number four. And Magnus here has the white pieces. He opens the game with one knight to f3. Obviously, um, what Magnus likes to do when playing low-rated players is that he likes in getting involved in strategic, complicated battles in which he will slowly outmaneuver his opponent. So Zhu continues with d5. We get g3, knight f6, bishop g2, c5, short castles. This is all pretty standard stuff in the King's Indian attack. And now after g6, there is this very interesting moment here. You can clearly see that both players um, are playing really fast at the moment. They haven't spent much time from the opening. And here Magnus spends quite a bit of his time. He spends about 8 minutes and plays this move d3. So obviously, it's not the point that Magnus hasn't seen this position. Of course, he has played this many times in different formats. Maybe it is due to the fact that he wanted to choose something solid and not complicate the matters early on. So after d3, bishop to g7, we get knight bd2. Obviously, now he might be intending to go for a central advancement with e4, putting pressure on Zhu Jiner's center. So, Zhu plays knight to c6 here. Magnus, of course, continues with e4, castles. We get rook to e1. And after d5, we can clearly see an interesting situation here. Zhu Jiner has 1 hour and 4 minutes on the clock, and Magnus here has 1 hour 20 minutes on the clock. Seemingly that Magnus is now pretty much comfortable with his position. He gets um, that confidence that he needs, and as well as getting more chances to fight for a win. So after e5, Magnus is of course attacking the knight. The knight has a decision whether it's gonna go back, or it is gonna just jump in the center. She plays knight to d5 here. Obviously, um, the more active move, putting pressure in the central squares. So Magnus here continues with a4, trying to advance on the queen side. And also, if the pawn happens to reach a6, that would very much complement this light squared bishop, as it will have more scope on the queen side. So at this point, Zhu Jiner plays h6, maybe stopping knight to g5 ideas in the eventual future. Magnus continues with his plan of knight to c4. Now his play will obviously be on the queen side here, trying to complement the light squared bishop. So after bishop to e6, Magnus continues bishop to d2, pretty standard stuff so far, developing his pieces. And here we can clearly see an interesting moment where Magnus spends a lot of time here trying to decide between the moves knight f d2 and bishop to d2, and in the eventual um, case, he happens to play bishop to d2 after spending almost 20 plus minutes on the clock. So after knight b6 here, which happens to be an inaccuracy, apparently the computer wanted Zhu to play queen to d7, maybe with the intent that she would want to put the bishop on g4 without having to worry about this h3 move. So Magnus, after this knight to b6 move, continues with b3, solidifying the knight here in the c4 square, and now we get the move knight to d5. So obviously now his opponent rather um does waste a bit of time here, putting a knight on b6, then putting it back on d5, and maybe she is at this moment trying to decide on how to actually bring her pieces into the game. So after knight to d5, Magnus here thinks for quite a while, and then he makes this mistake with knight to h4. Obviously, um, what he might have intended with this knight h4 move is that he wants to complement the bishop on g2. He would also, in the eventual future, like to play f4 and put the knight behind the pawn as of stopping these g5 ideas. But what he actually missed is that um, his opponent can actually go g5 at this very moment. And since the knight doesn't have any good squares, now he has to go back to f3 and waste time, because now if the knight goes back to f3 and then, like, let's say Zhu gets g4 and h5, her position will be much better, for which after this sequence of moves, knight f3, queen d7, she immediately stops this h3 move as well, and now she is better already. So after h4, now she goes for this g4 move, for which at this point you can clearly see now that the structure has greatly improved. This knight is well out of the game at this moment. Even if it goes to f1, it still cannot go to e3, and judging by the fact that now Magnus is severely low on time on move 17, of which he still has to make quite a lot of moves to reach time control, this will be a very difficult road for him. So after queen to c1, we get f6 here. She is, of course, trying to undermine this pawn on e5. At the very same time, she is trying to take um, control over the central squares here, right? So Magnus continues with bishop to h6, looking for counterplay on the king side. We get rook to f7, and now Magnus continues here to unravel the pawns on the king side with the move f3. Obviously, the idea of f3 is that he wants to activate his knight here on h2, which is kind of sad at this moment. It's stuck on the rim of the board, and now we get a continuation of bishop to h8, which happens to be a mistake apparently, according to the engines, as um, they voucher here that Zhu should continue with king to h7. So obviously, a more human move, bishop to h8, we can't blame her. She's playing Magnus Carlsen, and she is also low on time as well. After bishop h8, Magnus continues with takes, and now we get takes, and this bishop to g5 move. So after bishop to h8 once more, she tries to avoid the exchange of the dark squared bishop, keeping in mind that this bishop is a main defender of the dark squares around the black king. Sorry about that. So we get knight to f1 from Magnus, trying to activate his knight, maybe bring it to the e4 square in the eventual future. Now Zhu continues with knight to c3, we get knight to d2, bishop to d5, and now we get this strategic maneuver of the knight to the e4 square. Something that we can greatly admire from Magnus is that he always takes care of his pieces and knows where to actually put them. So after bishop takes on e4, which turns out to be a great mistake um, by his opponent, because after bishop takes e4 and rook af8, Magnus has this continuation with bishop to h6. Obviously, now the rook is under attack, and if now she decides to trade off the bishop, the queen gets active on the king side, and the game will take a wild turn. So after queen to c7 here, Magnus continues with um, queen g5 check. Obviously, now the king does not have any legal moves. And now, let's say if she had decided here to play the move bishop to g7, then the pawn on g4 would fall. And also, seeing that the black king is severely weak, this position does not get better for black. So here she decides to sack the exchange with rook to g7. Then we get bishop takes g7. Obviously, Magnus will take the material. And after queen takes on g3 check, Magnus just retreats his bishop here on from the e4 square to g2, trying to cover up his king. So after bishop takes on g7, we get king to h1, trying to avoid this rook to f2 move, of which the bishop will be pinned. So Zuzina continues with rook to f2 anyways, and now Magnus plays rook to g1. Now we can clearly see now that the idea of moving the king to h1 was to evacuate the g1 square so that the rook would defend the bishop. So after e6, we get rook a f1, trying to exchange the pieces here and relieve the pressure on the king. So we get knight to f2 here, and after rook takes on f2, queen takes on f2, rook to a1. Both players here are quite low on time. They are desperately trying to reach move 40 in order to gain that 30 minutes additional time. So after rook to a1, we get this horrible blunder from Zuziner with knight to g3, a move that seems pretty normal because in chess we are always taught that we should calculate the most forcing moves first. So obviously forcing moves are checks, captures, and threats, and since a check is a more forcing move, what couldn't be more natural than giving a check to a seemingly weak king? Because after king to h2, we get knight to f5, and the pawn on g4 is hanging at the very moment. And due to the fact that this king is quite undefended, as the white pieces are gonna get involved in the game pretty quickly and try to checkmate it. So after queen c2, we get rook to e1. Now the rook is also active, and seeing that Magnus is also up in material, this game is going to take a wild turn around. So we get knight to d8. There's rook to e2 here, attacking the queen. And after queen takes on d3, Magnus here continues with the move bishop to e4, attacking the queen on d3. And it was in this position that Zuziner resigned the game. So why did she actually resign? It might be due to the fact that at this point she actually sees that her position is way terrible than she had imagined before. So obviously, if you take the pawn on b3, then bishop takes on f5 results in a checkmating sequence here with moves like rook to e8, king to h7, and then queen to h5 check, for which if you block by the bishop, then you just get checkmated. In this sequence, king to g8 would just result in a quick checkmate here, and if you go here, this is also an eventual checkmate as well. Say you block by the bishop, still the same thing as just like that. So Great win from Magnus here after being under massive pressure in the opening, and he continues his winning speed run of the year. So in round 6, now Magnus plays the famous American grandmaster here, young um, talent from the US, Andy Woodward, and he has the black pieces here. So Andy rather, opens with 1 d4, knight f6, c4, g6. So now we get a setup where Magnus might intend to play the King's Indian defense with d6, or he might actually intend to play the Grunfeld, which happens to be a very interesting opening as well. He might also try to transpose into the Benoni defense, which he actually had against Niels Grandelius. So after knight c3, bishop g7, and e4, we get pawn to d6 from Magnus, which initiates that he wants to play the King's Indian defense. So after bishop to e2, long castles, bishop to e3, we get the move pawn to a5. This is the main line of the King's Indian defense, and there are quite a number of master games here that were played even in 2025, 2024, 2023. Pragnananda also happened to have played this setup quite a lot of time. Ivan Saric also had played this, and interestingly enough, Magnus Carlsen's own second from the FIDE World Chess Championship 2021, Jordan van Forest, which he played in round 4. Do check out the first video. Also had this setup against Pragnananda in 2022. So, going back to the game, after a5, and it continues with knight to f3, we get knight to g4 here, putting pressure on the dark squared bishop on e3. Now, Andy, of course, does not want to trade off that bishop for the knight, so he goes bishop to g5, we get h3, and now the bishop goes back to c1. Now, I totally do not understand why the engine would actually recommend the bishop to sit on g3, considering that Magnus's entire play here revolves around playing e5, and the bishop would be quite dull if he does achieve that successfully. So Andy here makes a logical human decision with bishop to c1, of course, and now after castles, knight to f6, we get the move bishop to e3. Players threaten us with a repetition, and Magnus kindly declines it. Now we get h3, attacking the bishop, attacking the knight on g4. Magnus retreats the knight to f6. We get bishop to e3, takes, and now knight to c5. Now, obviously, the idea around the King's Indian is that black is intending to put pressure on the white center, and if he does manage to trade off one of the central pawns, and put a knight on c5 or on e5, put a rook on a8, putting immense pressure on the center, he has achieved his plan here successfully. So we get the move f3, knight to h5 here. Obviously, now he is looking to cash in on the king side. Now we get queen to d2 here, putting pressure on the h6 pawn. Magnus advances the pawn forward with the move g5. I'm not sure why my microphone is doing that. Okay, that was weird. All right, let's just continue. So Magnus advances the pawn here with the move g5, and now we get bishop to d1 from Andy Woodward. Now, the idea of the move bishop to d1 is that Andy is looking forward to put pressure on the light squared weaknesses around Magnus's king. So he might be intending to put the bishop on c2 in the eventual case if the e4 pawn gets traded. Now, after bishop to e6, We get the move b3 here as the pawn on c4 was under attack. Then we get the move a4 from Magnus, trying to weaken the structure around the queen side. Now, we get the move bishop to c2. Obviously, now Andy is initiating the ideas that I mentioned earlier. And after takes, we get bishop to e5, and the game here takes a wild turn around. So, obviously, the idea now is that Magnus will attack Andy's king, and Andy will try to infiltrate Magnus's position from the queen side as well. So after rook to a7, Magnus here continues with the move c6, obviously stopping any knight to d5 ideas, and he would like to put the queen there without having to worry that he will have to trade off that knight on d5. So after knight c e2, Magnus continues with knight to f4. We get bishop to f2 here, takes, and now after queen to f6, both players are approaching move 40, and they are quite low on time as well. So after bishop to e3, Magnus here sacrifices the bishop with bishop takes h3. Obviously, the intent of this is firstly to complicate the position as much as possible, and secondly, he would like to create weaknesses around the white king. So if Andy had taken the bishop on h3, then queen takes on f3 would result in a slightly better position for Magnus, as this king is completely exposed and there are weaknesses all over around it. So Andy does not accept this sacrifice. He goes b4, and after knight to d7, now he plays rook takes on b7, initiating counterplay of his own as he is trying to create a pass pawn on the queen side. Now Magnus retreats the bishop to e6, and now Andy makes this huge mistake with the move knight to d4, overlooking that Magnus now can activate his rook via the a file and try to put more pressure on Andy's king. So now we get knight to e6, queen takes on e6, and now after bishop to d3, which happened to be Andy's final mistake, considering that he played this move with only 2 seconds on the clock, and he got obviously the additional 30 seconds because every time they make a move, then you get 30 seconds increment. So after this last final mistake, bishop to d3, Magnus continues with rook a1 check, king f2, and after knight to f6, we can clearly see now that the king on f2 is greatly exposed. So after the move rook to a7, Magnus continues with rook to h1 here, obviously looking for ideas like rook to h2 and g4. Now Andy's position is very difficult at the moment, and it's only a matter of conversion, of which Magnus does deliver that um, um, at the moment. So after rook to a1, obviously is attacking the queen is pinned to the rook, and after Andy decides to sacrifice material here, it's only a matter of technique. And at this moment, right around here, they do gain the additional 30 minutes because after king to d2, they after this king to d2 move, they did reach 40, and then they gained the extra 30 minutes. And Magnus went on to do his job here, considering that he's up a lot of material. The queen to d1 check, king to d2, and after this move pawn to d5, it was this moment that Andy Woodward resigned the game, simply because of this pawn is going to have a great life. Magnus is going to try to get a second wife. Of course, that's a joke. Magnus is just going to try to get a second queen, and he will win a lot of material here, as Andy would try to sacrifice material for the pawn. So let's just say if he had played this rook to d7 move, trying to pin the pawn, then there's simply knight to d3 check, and of course if you take, then you lose everything here. The check, the king can even go to h7, and now this is just completely lost, because after check, let's say king to here, there's even this trying to win the g2 pawn, but the engine also gives g3. Whichever way here suits you, happens to be winning. Check here, I think, and then you can like play all sorts of various moves here. Try to win the g2 pawn and try to queen your pawn as well. So great win from Magnus as he gets closer to winning the TePe Sigeman and Core Festival 2026.